beauty can be light, loving and protective, yet beauty can also be dark, scary and malicious. So enjoy this week's case analysis with me, Dr Fiona Girkin. I specialise in dark personalities of women and the tactics they use to get what they want. I thought I would do both audio and video recording for the final podcast episode, since most people listen to this podcast on YouTube. Of course, if you are on the podcast platform or listening to the audio-only version on YouTube and you want to watch the video, feel free to click the link in the description. So this will be the final episode of the Dark Beauty series. And in this episode, we'll summarise what's been discussed throughout all these case discussions we've done as part of this series. So stay tuned to the very end to find out what's next for this podcast. The Dark Beauty series of Leadership Shenanigans, my original podcast, was an opportunity for me to talk about some of the real criminal cases I've discovered over my time studying the female psychopath and give you some insight into how women, such as these, met the criteria for not only psychopathy but also narcissism, Machiavellianism and sadism. These 4 personality types make up the Dark Tetrad, previously known as the Dark Triad, which now includes sadism. Across this series, we've examined 9 women, 9 very different crimes, contexts and lives. From the Silicon Valley CEO to the suburban housewife, from the USA to the UK and of course Australia. From the social media influencer to the female DV perpetrators. If you're here for the first time, buckle up. These are real stories of women who have used charm, lies, or outright cruelty to commit serious crimes. We've explored fraud, false claims, poisonings, and abuse. Let's quickly run through each of the cases to bring you up to speed. In episode 1, we kicked things off with Elizabeth Holmes and the Theranos scandal. This Stanford dropout convinced investors, the media, and even governments that her revolutionary blood testing device could run hundreds of tests from just a few drops of blood. The reality? It didn't work. She was convicted of wire fraud for misleading investors and patients, a masterclass in charisma, overriding science, and a reminder that big promises can hide massive deceptions. Next up, in episode 2, we looked at Melissa Caddick, the Australian financial advisor who ran a classic Ponzi scheme. She promised clients big returns, but instead used other people's money to live a life of luxury with designer clothes, overseas trips, jewellery, and a big expensive house in Sydney. The works. The scheme collapsed when she was raided by the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC. The following day, she vanished and only her foot in a single running shoe was ever found, but she is presumed dead. Caddick's story is a stark warning about unchecked greed and the trust people place in successful women in finance. Then we come to Belle Gibson in episode 3, where we discussed the wellness influencer who built an empire on false cancer claims. She said she cured her brain cancer through diet and natural therapies, selling apps, books and products to thousands. Turns out she never had cancer at all. She was convicted of fraud by deception and consumer fraud. Her case exposes how vulnerability and hope can be weaponised in the health and wellness space. In episode 4, we shifted to welfare and government fraud with Istarlin Hassan, a Melbourne mother of 7 accused of leading a syndicate that allegedly raked in hundreds of thousands in fraud through the National Disability Insurance Scheme, childcare subsidies and family daycare scams. By exploiting systems meant to help vulnerable people, she and her group allegedly defrauded taxpayers on a massive scale. A sobering look at how fraud can target public funds and real people in need. Episode 5 brought us to the bizarre case of Sherri Papini, a Californian mum who vanished during a jog, triggering a huge search and claims of abduction by 2 Hispanic women. She reappeared weeks later with a dramatic story of captivity, but evidence showed it was all fabricated, and she'd staged the whole thing and lied to police. She was convicted of making false statements to law enforcement, and her hoax wasted resources and eroded trust in real victims. And who could forget Anna Delvey, also known as Anna Sorokin, in episode 6, the infamous fake German heiress who conned New York's elite with fake bank statements, luxury hotel stays, and invented wealth. She defrauded banks, hotels, and friends through fraud and identity deception. Her story, now a Netflix series, shows how confidence and a good backstory can open doors until the lies catch up with you. We then turn to a darker, more personal form of harm in episode 7 with Sarah Rigby and a case of domestic violence and coercive control. In this episode, we discussed how women can perpetrate serious abuse in relationships. Coercive control, manipulation and violence aren't gender exclusive, and this story underscores the need to recognise female perpetrators in domestic settings. In one of our most recent chilling episodes, episode 8, we talked about Erin Patterson and the death cap mushroom tragedy. She invited family members to lunch, serving a meal laced with deadly mushrooms. 3 people died, another came very close to death. Erin was charged with homicide by poisoning. This case gripped Australia and raised questions about intent, foraging dangers, and family dynamics. And finally, episode 9 with Jordan Worth, the British woman convicted in a landmark case of coercive control and domestic violence against her partner Alex. She subjected him to physical torture, starvation, isolation, and controlling behaviour over years. Jordan pleaded guilty to grievous bodily harm with intent and coercive control, one of the first major UK prosecutions highlighting that men can be victims of female-perpetrated abuse. So there you have it, deception, fraud, manipulation and harm. From billion-dollar blood-testing lies to poisoned family lunches. These episodes show that women can be just as capable of calculated wrongdoing as men, and that's exactly why we talk about it. To challenge assumptions, expose patterns, and remind everyone that abuse, fraud, and toxicity don't discriminate by gender. If you've been with me from episode 1, thank you. If you're just joining, go back and listen. These stories are wild, unsettling, and important. If you're on YouTube, leave a comment. What did you think of the Dark Beauty series? Which case shocked you the most? At first glance, these stories seem disconnected. But when we step back and examine them through a psychological lens, specifically the Dark Tetrad, clear and unsettling patterns begin to emerge. This final episode is not about retelling these stories, it's about connecting them. What do these women share psychologically? Where do they differ? And what does that tell us about how women deceive and harm others? The series examined these female criminals within the Dark Tetrad framework, which encompasses 4 interconnected personality traits. The first is narcissism, which is grandiosity, entitlement, and obsession with image. Machiavellianism, notable by strategic manipulation and calculated deceit. Psychopathy, which is emotional detachment, lack of empathy, remorselessness, and no ability to self-reflect. And lastly, sadism, which is deriving pleasure or gratification from others' suffering. These traits are on a continuum and vary between individuals in how they are demonstrated and how much they impact the behaviour. Narcissism is the most consistent trait across the women in the series. Elizabeth didn't just run a company, she believed she was destined to change the world. Anna didn't pretend to be wealthy, she was the fantasy she created. Belle positioned herself as a saviour. Melissa lived as though rules simply didn't apply to her. In each case, identity was carefully constructed and aggressively defended. But narcissism isn't limited to public figures. In the domestic violence cases of Sarah and Jordan, it became interpersonal. These partners were not equals, they were extensions of ego, expected to comply, admire and obey. And in Erin Patterson's case, narcissism appeared as entitlement to sympathy, control of the narrative, and a refusal to accept responsibility despite the catastrophic consequences. Across all 9 cases, narcissism explains one core belief: I am special and therefore I am exempt. So if narcissism answers the why, Machiavellianism explains the how. These were all impulsive crimes. Elizabeth structured her board to avoid scrutiny. Melissa fabricated statements and curated exclusivity. Stalin exploited welfare systems with precision. Anna manipulated social norms. Sherri manipulated law enforcement and public sympathy. Belle weaponised parasocial trust. And in domestic violence abuse cases, Machiavellianism became total control. Phones were monitored, messages were deleted, family ties were severed. Reality was rewritten. Erin Patterson represents the most extreme form. Months of planning, digital wipes, staged illness, and calculated deception of family bonds. Across these cases in this series, people were not people. They were a means to an end. Psychopathy is about the absence of empathy, remorse, and emotional character. Fraud victims lost life savings, cancer patients' treatment was delayed, friends were financially ruined, And yet apologies were rare, accountability was absent. In domestic violence cases, psychopathy became unmistakable. Sarah and Jordan escalated the abuse without hesitation. Suffering did not stop them, it didn't even slow them. And Erin Patterson's behaviour, calm poisoning, feigned illness, denial after conviction, reflects chilling emotional detachment. Psychopathy here is procedural and relentless, a quest for power, control and dominance over others. Sadism is where the cases diverge the most. In most fraud cases, there's no evidence of pleasure in suffering. Harm was inflicted but not revelled in. It was about an inward focus on gratification rather than observing harm in most of the cases. But in intimate violence cases, something changes. Jordan starved, humiliated and tortured her partner. She described abuse as addictive. Pain was not incidental, it was the point of her actions. Sarah's abuse also crossed into deprivation beyond control. Erin Patterson sits in an ambiguous space. Choosing a slow, agonising poison raises questions not of impulse but of deliberate cruelty through indifference. Sadism appears most clearly where victims are trapped, dependent and powerless, and was only really evident in the cases of homicide and domestic violence, so Erin, Jordan and Sarah. One pattern cuts across the entire series. The closer the victim, the darker the traits become. Distant victims saw the portrayal of behaviour that was narcissistic and Machiavellian and dominant, whereas in intimate victims, it was psychopathy and sadism that emerged the most. Fraud destroys lives financially. Abuse destroys them emotionally and psychologically. And society often minimises the latter, especially when the perpetrator doesn't fit the stereotype. This series was never about demonising women. It was about telling the truth. It was about raising awareness that women can also do bad acts. We just don't discuss them as much, and when we do, we look for excuses rather than justice for the victims. Women can manipulate, women can abuse, women can destroy lives without remorse. When we deny the reality, we fail victims, especially those whose suffering doesn't align with expectations. The Dark Tetrad doesn't excuse behaviour, but it explains patterns, why apologies fell hollow, why blame is deflected, why harm escalates, why image is protected at all costs. Across these 9 cases, one truth remains. Evil is rarely obvious. It is often articulate, persuasive and alluring. So what's up next for Leadership Shenanigans podcast? Thank you to those who have joined me throughout this series. So firstly, I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to fix the original name from a Leadership Shenanigans to just call it Shenanigans because I no longer focus just on workplace management. Keeping with my work on female psychopaths and those with dark traits, I've decided to continue with the true crime narrative for the podcast. And there is a series of cases that I've found particularly concerning. Cases where women have harmed their babies and children. There appear to be several cases in the US of women throwing babies in the bin or in a dumpster. This series may be harder to listen to than the last, but I will again focus more on the dark behaviour and personality rather than the in-depth details of the case, which can be quite disturbing. This series will be called Bad Mama, and I'll now do the video as well as the audio for these, given the number of people who watch on YouTube. So make sure you subscribe to the podcast or to my YouTube channel so you know when these episodes drop. Thank you for staying till the end of this video. Please don't forget to like the video if you haven't already. And remember, beauty can be light, loving and protective, but it can also be dark, scary and malicious. I've been Dr. Fiona Girkin. Till next time, stay safe from the dark women in the world.